the clerks to read the legal notice, please, on the first item, which is action item A.
Notice is hereby given that a public hearing will be held at a meeting of the Washington County Land Use and Planning Committee on Thursday, June 24th, 2021 at 7:30 a.m. in room 1019 of the Washington County Government Center, 432 East Washington Street, West Bend, Wisconsin, 53095, at which time there will be heard and considered the public hearing for public comment on Amendment 2021-1 for the substantial agreement framework of a multi-jurisdictional comprehensive plan for Washington County 2050, and the proposed ordinance and resolution will be discussed as stated in the published notice of public hearing dated May 17th, 2021.
Thank you. We'll declare the public hearing open at this point in time. Are there any comments from the public? Any comments from any supervisors here? Hearing no comments, and we will close the public hearing. And with that, I will call on Ms. Silsky, Deb Silsky, is going to make some comments or some explanation points.
Morning.
Good morning.
There we go. All right. So I did go through the amendment details with you at the last meeting. And as we discussed, I did reach out to all of our local governments, the cities, towns, and villages in Washington County, to get an idea if they had any questions or concerns about this amendment. I did talk directly with 10 local governments. I handed out to you a sheet reviewing the comments. All the comments that we received were all positive. The Village of Richfield administrator wanted to say that he is definitely in favor of any situation that allows for more local control. In the discussion that I had with the city of West Bend, they did have two recommendations. The first recommendation is that the county require developers to delineate primary environmental corridors or isolated natural resource areas that are part of a plat submittal. And then they also wanted us, they recommended the county to provide language on a final plat that would be recorded, talking about the preservation of those primary environmental corridors. So as part of the state law with getting comments from a public hearing and any comments that I received when reaching out to different local governments, we're obligated as a county to have a formal response to every single one of those comments. So I provided the staff recommendation, which is in the last half of the sheet that I handed out. So the first one is in relation to the recommendation by the city of West Bend for the delineation of the primary environmental corridors and isolated natural resource areas. So I did touch base with Sewer PAC. Sewer PAC is the entity that's responsible for the delineation and review of those environmental corridors. And in the discussion that I had with them, they were saying that requiring a field verification of these environmental corridors for every plat would certainly delay the process of the land division review if it was required. And the fact that as their responsibility, every 5 years, Sewer PAC goes through and reviews and updates those environmental corridors and isolated natural resource areas. So they thought that that was kind of an excessive, burdensome responsibility or recommendation that the county would place on those. So it's really the recommendation of the planning staff that we use the existing primary environmental corridors and isolated natural resource areas for planning purposes. But field verification is only required when warranted based on the guidelines for compatible development, which is table 2.1 of the county comprehensive plan. For the second recommendation that the city had related to adding language to the final plat describing the protection of primary environmental corridors, we do believe that that's probably a good idea in describing the preservation of those areas. Many cities and villages do add a little note to that final plat. So that note would say something to the effect of the protection of these areas based on the guidelines for compatible development. Again, referring back to that table 2.1 in the comprehensive plan, which we follow. So if this committee is in agreement with the amendment as stated, as well as these staff recommendations that I just went over, the recommended motion that is on your committee report that I provided to you remains the same, but the planning staff that review the land division plats would just be adding these two items to our land division review process. So these two recommendations were good that the city of West Bend had, and we can certainly accommodate them to a certain degree. But it's really not a change to the motion or a change to the amendment. It's really just a change in the staff process. So it wouldn't change the actual motion that was provided to you in the staff report.
So that's strictly basically an internal procedural.
It is
change.
procedural.
All
Yes.
right, very good.
But I wanted to explain what the recommendations were by the city and explain to you that is certainly something that we could accommodate, except for the fact that we believe it would be very burdensome to require all plats to do a delineation. We just don't feel that it's warranted, but there may be situations where we would want field verification based on that table 2.1 guidelines. And then we would request the developer to hire an environmental professional that would be able to do that and then go through the process of that delineation working with sewer pack. Very procedural.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Thank you. Hearing that, at this point in time, we'll entertain a motion and a second to approve the draft 2021 resolution to adopt amendment 2021-1 of a multi-jurisdictional comprehensive plan for Washington County 2050 substantial agreement framework and forward to the county board for consideration. Do we have a motion? Supervisor Schulteis, is there a second? Supervisor Krebs. We have a motion and a second. Supervisor Gallitz, I assume you're with us all the way this morning?
I am. Just a quick question
Yes, sir.
for Deb. Those concerns by West Bend that you said would be added to staff checklist, is that sufficiently acceptable by West Bend?
I did not circle back with the city of West Bend and provide them with the staff recommendation.
Okay. But we have no reason they would object to that. Not that we're trying to appease everybody, but I just want to make certain, since we asked for their feedback and we provided a response, that this is a sufficient action and the motion doesn't need to reflect any of the adoption of that checklist.
Yeah, the city of West Bend was not opposed to the amendment, how it was written. These were just suggested recommendations.
Great, thank you.
Any other questions or discussion? Mr. Krebs.
Wanted to dig a little deeper on the first recommendation, the requirement for the field verification. What happens if that is done and either the primary environmental corridors are expanded or found to not be as drawn on the maps?
Then they would, assumption is that they would have to go through the process of a formal amendment with sewer PAC, and there are procedures that need to be followed that sewer PAC would go through to actually formally change where that delineation is on their map.
Would that cause delay for a proposed development or
Yes,
plot?
it would,
Okay,
probably by several months.
I'm just wondering if it's something that if we're going through I'm assuming that the developer bears the expense of field verification. Once we have an expert that's looked at that particular plot versus the general maps of sewer pack, if that's something that we can help move the development process along faster while the wheels of bureaucracy of sewer pack update their maps. I would like to see something added that basically the qualified environmental professional can help not cause a delay in these developments, if that makes sense.
It does, but there will be a
'Cause the form-
delay in the process for sewer PAC.
The
though.
formality of actually approving a new map shouldn't cause the delay of, it's like a surveyor, kind of is a professional of just the overall lot size. Environmental professional should be drawing the maps for the actual environmental in that area. So I don't know if there's any way we can incorporate, it's more the behind the scenes procedural thing, but I want that kind of on everyone's burner that we're not causing delays in the future, where if we have a development project that, gets
Yeah,
kicked down the road a year, 2 years,
So,
whatever it
um,
takes for sewer pack to react.
yeah, so a part of that is since October, when Paul and I started taking over the land division review, we are really trying to promote, and this is one of the things that I did talk to a lot of the local governments about. When there's a land division that comes through, it's ideal that when that first contact with the city or village or town, that someone contacts the county right away, and we can all sit down and talk about what potential issues there may be with the land division well before a developer even hires an engineer to start designing the concept plan.
Okay.
So that's really how to address your issue, is getting into the forefront of when developments are starting to occur, just starting to be talked about. That's when it would be nice for the county to have a seat at the table and talk about, these are the things that the county is going to be looking at, providing information to the developer and talking about what potential issues there would be. And that goes along with the shoreline wetland floodplain zoning, POUTS issues, erosion control, stormwater management. All of these things can be talked about way in advance before the developers hired an engineer to do a concept plan. And then there's added burden and added costs to that in the end. So that's something that we're really going to strive to do with land division.
I think that would definitely be something that the local governments need to, their zoning administrators or planners need to remind the developers or make sure the county's brought in on those earlier discussions, because most of them are really only looking at their own zoning and that's all they're worried about. So.
Yeah, actually what we've discovered is oftentimes they'll, go to the town and think, oh, I'm done. Check that off the list. And they don't realize that if a development is in an extraterritorial area, there's DOA review, there's potential DOT review, DNR review. There's a lot more involved in land division than most developers realize if they're not already familiar with doing land divisions.
Okay, thank you.
Yep.
Other comments or questions from anyone? Hearing none, we have a motion and a second. I'm sorry, Mr. Schulman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have a couple of questions with regard to, this is the first time I've read this, so I'm all in favor of protecting environmental corridors, but I have the same concern as Supervisor Krebs delaying the potential to delay projects and adding unnecessary regulations. That's my concern, that this could be what that is. So could you just walk us through that primary environmental corridor, what it's actually doing? Because as I understand it, based on one other development in Hartford, the Zern Farm, there's a primary environmental corridor there, and it's basically not stopping or doing anything to the development. So why would we want to add another step in the process, or a series of steps in the process?
So we're actually not adding the preservation of primary environmental corridors to the review process. So back in 2008, when the county board adopted the comprehensive plan, the preservation of primary environmental corridors is the first criteria for and one of the main recommendations of that plan. So the delineation and how it's delineated is really something that we are looking into as one part of the whole land division review process. When land division has been reviewed in the past, we've relied on the towns mainly and the local governments to really look at those areas and determine how those developments are going to be laid out in relationship to the preservation of those corridors. And when in fact, the county land division, now that Paul and I have taken over land division and is really looking at what's required, the comprehensive plan, the land division ordinance and the process that we look at, the items that we look at in reviewing a land division need to be consistent with the recommendations of the comprehensive plan. And one of the main recommendations, as I said, is preservation of primary environmental corridors. So this is actually something that the county should have been looking at in detail since 2008, based on this table 2.1 that's in the comprehensive plan. So and that 2.1 essentially says that there's a whole series of permitted uses within primary environmental corridors. And one of those is 1 home per 5 acre density, that there could be recreational areas, there could be roadways that go in, there's a whole list of things. And that table has actually not been looked at. So now that we're looking at this process and everything that goes into the process and putting procedures together, and the development that came through the Cedar Creek Estates that came through that shed light on the connection between land division and the comprehensive plan, and that need, the requirement for consistency, that has just shed light on the fact that we should have been doing this all along. So this 2.1, it does allow for that residential development, and we certainly are going to do everything in our power not to delay land division. And I think that when a land division comes forward, and hopefully we'll be hearing from the towns or the villages or the cities or the DOA, and talk to that developer, be proactive and talking to the developer and having an actual checklist that they can look at, updating our checklist, and identify, hey, you have primary environmental corridors here. You know, there's some stormwater management issues that we need to work with you on. There's some POUTS information that we need to work with you on. In the past, when there's been land division, that we've always said, well, once you get all of your approvals from the villages and the towns and cities, then come to the county and then we'll go through our process, and we're not going to start our 90-day process review until you have all of these things checked. Well, we're taking a proactive approach, and we're going to say, before you get your approvals at the town and the village, let's talk about what's needed. And so those recommendations can be incorporated in. So by the time it gets to the county, there shouldn't be a need for any revisions or any surprises, and then we should be able to work through that process very quickly. Does that answer your question?
Yes, I think so.
Okay.
We can talk about it after the fact too. before it goes to county board. I just get anxious about additional requirements that, and I understand what you're saying, that it's been on the books and we haven't enforced it. I guess I think I'm really happy that you and Paul are taking a much more active role in being proactive with customer service, because that hasn't always been the case, I feel like. But I'm orange, not gold. I'm very extroverted, so I'm much more wanting to just keep the process moving and be creative in moving things along. So I think you understand what I'm saying.
Yes. Yes, and our intention is not to delay any land divisions.
Yeah.
Our intention is just to get in front of the discussions.
But it's the rules we made ourselves that really have gotten us to this spot. Correct. I mean, basically, we're saying we're actually going to follow through with what we had written all those years ago, 20 years ago.
Essentially, yeah.
I'm not saying that's good or bad.
And to add a little more, this was the first, since the comprehensive plan was adopted, and I think I mentioned this in May, that since the comprehensive plan was adopted in 2008, we have never had a land division that prompted a comprehensive plan amendment before. This is the first one ever. So it really made us focus in on what that connection is and what we should as a county be looking at, and what are the things that we have authority over and should be looking at, and the things that we really should be hands off and let the local governments take charge. And that's where that second criteria is being recommended for complete elimination. So it's kind of I've really been kind of focusing in on, what do we even have authority over and what should we really be looking at? And then what other things should we really just let the local governments run with and not have a hand in it?
Mr. Chris.
One more quick question. Since we keep talking about table 2.1 with both recommendations, could you, and I'm not putting you on the spot now, but let us know where table 2.1 is? Because the comp plan, the physical one's pretty thick, I remember, and just looking now, it's 14 chapters plus A through J and appendixes.
Yep.
So
It is the first table in chapter 2.
chapter
So
2.
table 2.1,
Okay.
chapter 2, first table. Yep, and I actually do have a copy. If you do have any specific questions, or if you'd like me to hand that out, I'd be more than happy to do that. And this, so table 2.1, it shows the permitted uses, permitted development within a primary environmental corridor and isolated natural resource area. And all of those permitted uses do not require field verification at all. It's just when you get into specific exceptions that are in the notes, that's when it's required. So, so permitted uses, rural density residential, it's a permitted use, no field verification is required. Streets and highways within like woodlands and wildlife habitat are permitted, there's no field verification. So the number of times that a subdivision plat would require field verification, I think would be very minimal, because there's so many uses that are already permitted that do not require field verification. If that helps you out. Okay.
I have no further questions for now, and I would be in support of moving it to the full county board for debate. So I'll vote in favor of it for now to pass it along.
Chair Mary, could I have the floor, please? Thank you. Maybe in line with Executive Showman's comments or questions. So when this request for the land use amendment came in, which required us then to amend the comprehensive plan, did staff at that time do an overall look? I know it's pretty comprehensive, but I'm just trying to think ahead of that board meeting for questions that may arise there and what we could either address here or in prep for that meeting. Meaning, to your point, Deb, this was created or Mr. Showman, 20 some years ago. Is it in line with everyone's interest today? Things change in 20 years, and a vision 20 years ago may have changed. So I don't know what staff's full involvement in that overall review, or is it warranted as we look at making this amendment, to the comprehensive plan? Meaning, is there synergy, is in alignment with future growth and development, et cetera? Does that make any sense, Deb?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it sounds like you're interested in maybe a more robust review of the recommendations.
Well, maybe against the intent of that land use plan, and having been involved at a village level and town level in the past, I understand the general intent of it. But since this is incorporating all of those communities within Washington County, at what point in time do we, take pause, and is this still in line with all the desired growth plans? Is it in alignment with, I know it's, believe me, that's a long, that's a big project, right? So I'm just trying to understand, as we go to, 20 some supervisors in a month or so with this, will there be some similar questions? So I'm just trying to understand, can we head some of that off?
Well, one thing to keep in mind is that although the 3 criteria that's being proposed for amendment today was developed in 2004, adopted by the county board in 2004, it was discussed in great length with our advisory committee for the comprehensive plan that included most of the cities, villages, and, well, not the cities, but the villages and towns within Washington County. So there was a lot of input by the local governments in the development of those criteria. And the comprehensive plan itself was, although I mentioned that it was in 2008, we did just update the comprehensive plan, and it was adopted in April of 2019. So the current comprehensive plan, which still includes obviously these 3 criteria, that was just adopted a couple of years ago. And that incorporated all of the updates that were done by all the local governments. So our comp plan map is a patchwork of all of our local governments, and we pulled all of their updated plans and put them into the county plan. So, I mean, it has gone through a full, complete update just several years ago. The comprehensive plan is also reviewed. The recommendations are reviewed every 5 years when I do a report to the county board on what accomplishments we've done with the recommendations, what other recommendations need to be changed. So the county board has another opportunity, every 5 years. But obviously, the comprehensive plan can be amended at any point if the county board chooses to change the recommendations.
Okay, that is helpful. It's just a suggestion to maybe include that somehow, some way in the presentation with the board, since we have a third new board members that may not be as familiar with the plan use or past practices.
Okay. Yeah, I can certainly provide that information at the county board.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I can attest to everything Deb just said. I think what's difficult with these is you're sitting through that ad hoc committee listening to literally hours of discussion about comprehensive plans, and then you get a real life example like what prompted us here today, and all of a sudden your perspective changes entirely because it's happening in real life and you have concrete situations that you're discussing. So with regard to the word warranted specifically in that the table 2.1 that you're handing around, is it really things like if a developer tried to develop an entire environmental corridor, and I mean build houses in that environmental corridor,
Yeah.
that's really the type of thing we're talking about, not, as you mentioned, roads and parks and things of that nature.
There's actually been several developments that we actually were just looking at these yesterday where the development, almost the whole development was in a primary environmental corridor that had a road through it, had a cul-de-sac, had lots, and the homes were literally in the woods, in the upland woodlands. So it's not preventing that. It is just the identification and the acknowledgement of, the county board said, hey, we should be following and preserving primary environmental corridors according to this. And those are permitted uses without field verification.
Only in government,
So,
only in government.
and it was, but
Holy
remember,
cow.
please recall that this discussion was prompted by a comment from the city of West Bend that recommended that the county require field verification for every single land development. That is not what I am recommending. I am only recommending the field verification on the rare occasion that those developments do not follow this. So that's why I'm addressing it, because it was brought up and recommended by the city of West Bend.
Yes, thank you for clarifying that. I appreciate you saying that.
Any other comments or questions? All right, we have a motion and we have a second. I would move that we vote. Those in favor say aye. And opposed?
Aye.
Were you voting against, Mr. Gallitz?
No, that's an aye in favor.
Okay, thank you. With the passage on that, then we'll move a motion to approve draft 2021 ordinance to amend section 179.9 of the Washington County Code and forward to the county board for consideration. Is there a motion and a second for this, please, this action? Supervisor Krebs, motion. Supervisor Boltman, seconds. Any discussion on this? This is actually the motion to move the ordinance to the board for approval or for discussion at the July meeting. Any comments or questions? Hearing none, then we'll call for a vote on this. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? All right, that is passed. Then we'll move on to the next section of the public hearings this morning. Will the clerk please read the legal notice?
Notice is hereby given that a public hearing will be held at a meeting of the Washington County Land Use and Planning Committee on Thursday, June 24th, 2021 at 7:45 a.m. in room 1019 of the Washington County Government Center, 432 East Washington Street, West Bend, Wisconsin, 53095, at which time there will be heard and considered the public hearing for public comment on Amendment 2021-2 to consider a proposed amendment to the land use plan map of a multi-jurisdictional comprehensive plan for Washington County 2050, and the proposed ordinance and resolution will be discussed as stated in the published notice of public hearing dated May 17th, 2021.
Hearing the official notification, we'll open the public hearing on this matter. Are there any public comments regarding this issue?
Good morning. I'm Margaret Wilbur for the Village of Slinger, 300 Slinger Road, Slinger, Wisconsin. The village supports this request and we respectfully ask that you give it positive consideration. In response to the previous conversation and also this matter, it has created a tremendous opportunity for the village and town to work together.
Excuse me, could the speaker get closer to the mic, please?
In response to the last conversation and this matter, it has created a tremendous opportunity for the village and town to work together in what we hope will be an ongoing conversation regarding the intergovernmental cooperation and the boundaries between our two municipalities. And we ask for your consideration of this matter and would like to express our support. Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am. Other public comments? Hearing none, then we'll close the public hearing on this. I'd like to request a motion, please. This is for Amendment 2021-2, a multi-jurisdictional comprehensive plan for Washington County 2050 County Land Use Map Amendment. Is there a motion and a second, please?
Second.
Who made the motion? I'm sorry, I missed something. Okay, Supervisor Schultes with the motion, Supervisor Gallantz with the second. Any comments or discussion? Ms. Silsky.
I did, as I mentioned in the last amendment, I did reach out to all of our local governments and did have communications, direct discussion with 10 of our local governments, and they were all in support, very positive comments and no concerns with this amendment.
Thank you. Any comments or questions from any of the supervisors? Hearing none, we have a motion and a second for the adoption of Amendment 2021-2, a multi-jurisdictional comprehensive plan for Washington County 2050 County Land Use Plan Map. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Then that passes. Then we'll move on to the second point of this discussion, which is the ordinance adoption of 2021-2, a multi-jurisdictional comprehensive plan for Washington County Land Use Plan Map Amendment. Are there any questions? I'm sorry, we need a motion and a second on this matter, please. Supervisor Boltman makes the motion. Is there a second? Supervisor Schultes, any comments or discussion regarding this, the ordinance, moving this on to the county board for discussion? Hearing none, we'll vote on this matter then. All those in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Then the motion is passed. With that, then, let's return to the original agenda items and start with the consent agenda items 4A and 4B. The minutes of the May 27 meeting and June 9th meeting, as well as the Planning and Parks Department monthly updates. I'll entertain a motion and a second to accept these items as presented. Supervisor Krebs, Supervisor Boltman. Any comments or discussion on these matters, on the reports? Hearing none, then we'll vote to accept the consent agenda as presented. All in favor say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Passed. All right, now let's move on to the discussion on the Washington County Golf Course Endowment and Easement presentation. The policy question is, should the county pursue and jointly fund the creation of endowment fund to support parks and golf and execute a permanent conservation easement on 283 acres of county-owned land, the Washington County Golf Course? We're looking for consensus from this body to move this as a full board for discussion and action. I'll let you know the executive committee has already endorsed this and is in full support. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Supervisor Krebs. Give us some background on this. He was first approached on this project. Supervisor Krebs, please.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Yeah, I feel I had a small part in this project so far, but to provide the background information to this committee was tasked with listing and selling the family park piece of property several months back. And after we met and discussed that, I was approached by members of some of the original donating families that helped put together the funds for the golf course. And that they were concerned about the selling off of some of the land, and I think summarizing that they had concerns about wanting to protect what some of the original intent of the entire golf course property was. So our conversations started small with Family Park, but they quickly grew to be much larger, encompassing the whole golf course. From that point, I brought our county executive and county board chairman into the discussions. And from honestly that point, our executive really put the polish on some of the discussions and the plan that's being presented here today. So with that, I would probably let Josh cover more of the details of kind of the end plan, where it got to at this point. But this has just been another great example of some of the original founding donors of the golf course coming back, stepping up again, really trying to preserve what a asset the county has out at this golf course location so far, and throughout our entire parks department. So with that, with the chair's approval, I would pass it on to the executive for his comments.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you, Supervisor Krebs. So Supervisor Krebs laid out kind of the introduction of what happened. I'll just point out to you that the families that donated the land over 30 years ago now, when that donation occurred, there was never anything more than a handshake agreement that this would be a golf course for the county in perpetuity. And so I think that predominantly has driven the families to try to kind of go back and make sure that this is something that lasts for the posterity of the county. And so that's really what started and has driven the conversation to this point. Where we're at today, as you saw in the committee report, is something much broader than just Family Park or a portion thereof. This is really about protecting really the legacy of the golf course into perpetuity. As you can see, we're contemplating as much as a $2.5 million trust or endowment fund that would be created. We're still in the midst of negotiations of what that looks like exactly. But the give on the county side would be $1.25 million, as you can see, from a variety of sources. And we have a number of ideas where that might come from, including the golf course itself over time. But then the other thing that it would do is really create two separate funds. So the county would be encumbering its own $1.25 million, but the families and donors that they engage would encumber their own. So what am I saying? What I'm saying is the county can have control over the proceeds of the $1.25 million that we put forth, and the families would have control over the $1.25 million they put forth, with the intent on both ends being that if the county wants to do projects specific to parks and recreation, generally speaking, there would be consensus to do those types of things. And when things get into a gray area, is that really what we intended? The hope is there's some verbiage, bylaws, if you will, that would help guide that discussion on the family side. And the county still has the ability to kind of do what it wishes with the proceeds. Ultimately, what this would also do, the other kind of give on the county's part, would be that it would put an easement, a permanent easement, on the 283 acres. In other words, it would restrict our use of that land perpetually, meaning forever. And so it's certainly a give on our part insofar as we could never sell it, we could never develop it. There's certainly flexibilities that are being discussed. Obviously, we have current structures, for example, throughout the golf course, some larger than others. For example, the clubhouse or the maintenance shop on the north end versus a number of shelters as you get farther south. And so those pieces are in negotiation, but the intent really, I think, of the family, and Supervisor Krebs and Chairman Mary can attest to this as well. They've been part of the discussions. I think the intent is to keep it as a golf course as long as possible and as park use, if you will, as the layperson would consider that into perpetuity. In other words, it's not to say that we couldn't one day, I'll be a little bit hyperbolic, we couldn't one day turn it into a polo grounds or a horse racing track if that's something that government gets into 50 years from now. But it's certainly restricted from turning it into condos or homes or some other kind of commercial or private use. So that's really just a thumbnail sketch of where we're at today. We wanted to make sure we got in front of this committee and the executive committee before we really went much farther. We've had conversations with the West Bend Community Foundation to be potentially the host of the trust fund. We've had conversations with the Ozaukee Washington Land Trust. The family's interested in engaging them in particular in helping draft up the language for the easement, which we concur with, but also maybe some, as I said, bylaws or covenants, if you will, for how that land is to be used and who will manage it. And then we have internally begun the discussions of how that might be utilized moving forward. So if it's a $2.5 million trust, the West Bend Community Foundation, which is operated by the Greater Milwaukee Foundation, they have indicated to us you can anticipate approximately a 4% return on that investment. So you're talking somewhere between 100 and 150,000 on the high end of annual revenue. The family's intentions, the farther we have got along, is that could really help the entire park and trail system in Washington County. Doesn't have to specifically be the golf course. But certainly the idea is if we get to a point 15 or 20 years from now when golf is out of vogue and the golf course is really struggling, that these dollars would help keep the course going without needing property taxes or taxpayer money of any kind. And then in the event that it continues to do as well as it's done, or at least break even, those dollars can go to fund other improvements or operations, things of that variety as well. So again, that's the thumbnail sketch of where we're at, the direction we're going. We're asking your consensus to continue that process. As Supervisor Mary said, the executive committee was very supportive of the idea. I will mention that Mayor Mahalik, Supervisor Mahalik, had voiced some concerns about the perpetuity of the proposal, it being now in the city of Hartford. Obviously, the county would come out pretty good in this situation if everything comes to fruition as we laid it out, but the city would miss out on any potential development and thereby any tax opportunity down the road. So he did voice that concern at executive committee. He's voiced that concern to me since then. And I think he alluded to the possibility of having some kind of sunset or 3/4 vote of the board or something of that variety. At this point, I'm not inclined to go in that direction. A gift of this size, I think isn't something I'm interested in messing around with, and any amount of taxation that we could get off of that property, if we were to develop parts of it, won't be anywhere near $125,000 to the county. Certainly, the school districts and the city aren't going to benefit on the tax side directly, but I think you could very easily argue they'll benefit in other ways. So as of right now, I'm not inclined to do it. I will mention it to the families just so everybody's aware of that. I think it's fair that they know that the mayor has those feelings. But I think that's the long and short of it, unless there's anything I'm missing.
Thank you, Mr. Showman. I've participated in some of the meetings with the family members, with Supervisor Krebs and County Executive Showman. And one of the comments that was expressed to executive committee, Executive Showman said, we have no idea what will happen to the future of golf, whether 30 years from now, that'll still be a golf course. But keeping this land in a conservancy sort of situation, I think certainly keeps totally within the spirit of the original families and their intentions when when the golf course was developed, which ironically is celebrating its 25th anniversary. So at this point in time, we're not, I'm sorry, Mr. Schulman.
Can I add one thing if I might? Just for context, the $2.5 million is certainly reflective of, you mentioned the 25th anniversary, so 2.5 million for 25 years. But more specifically, where did we come up with that number? It's not just a random number. When we started these discussions, as Supervisor Krebs kind of alluded to, it really started with talking about the 3 acres at Family Park, and then it ballooned very quickly. And the families really wanted to use that as a springboard into talking about protecting the golf course into perpetuity. So basically, I came back quickly with, well, the golf course is worth something. We need to determine what it's worth before we put this type of a restriction on it. And what we did was we went back to the sale of the bog, which is in Cedarburg, to identify basically a number that we could at least start from. The families I would say were a little nervous about that, but they understood where I was coming from. The bog sold about 5 years ago for $1.99 million. It was distressed. It's a little bit different than our course. It has some banquet facilities, but it's the golf course itself is very comparable in quality. And so that's really where we started, that 1.99, and how do we get to that number? It grew to 2.5 for the 25th year, and then this kind of 50-50 split, it kind of was one more step. So from I guess kind of addressing Mayor Mahalik concern, we're asking for essentially hitting a threshold 25% above the sale price of the bog. And there's another golf course, my understanding, on I-43, I think it's called the Fireside or something like that, that is currently for sale, that is also in that $1.5 million range. So we're very much in line with the market, at least as it has been, albeit one sale was distressed. I don't know about the other one, but just so you're aware of that, it's not, we didn't just pull $2.5 million out of nowhere. It came from the sale of the bog.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Again, this morning, what we're doing for is basically looking as an endorsement from this committee, such that this goes to the full county board next month. It'll have that endorsement. The executive committee has given its support to this. And at this point in time, I'm just asking your endorsement. I would suggest if you're in favor of it, say aye. Aye. Anybody opposed? Thank you.
Chair opposed, but when are we able to share any thoughts or comments? Is that intended for the board meeting?
Yes.
Well, okay, sorry, maybe I misunderstood. I just, as I heard Executive Showman present, I'm in favor, I guess, in general. It makes a lot of sense, but do have, I guess, more behind the scenes type questions, such as the potential conflict between the two funds on, future work and monies, how that would be ironed out. How does this align with the current, Golf Enterprise Fund, I believe it's called, and our part of the funding, the impact to general fund, when do those dollars are allocated or segregated, and how does that impact? So those are a number of questions that are or thoughts that are just running through my mind, and I suspect many other board members would have similar concerns, questions, thoughts.
Mr. Showman.
Yeah, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Supervisor Galitz, those are some good questions, and I'll just try to tick them off, and if I miss one, if you want to just reiterate, that would be appreciated. So a few things. The explicit reason that we are going down the path of one endowment with two separate trust funds is so that there isn't necessarily a need for ironing out. So I was pretty adamant in our discussions that if the county makes a decision that they want to use $125,000 of the proceeds for a dog park at Family Park, that we can do that. If that's what the board decides they want to do, there's nobody that can stop the board from using those funds that way. On the other hand, if the family says, I mean, you can do whatever you want out there, it's within the confines of the easement, but we don't want to support a dog park, they have the ability to say, our portion isn't going to go to that. We'll hold it until next year. They can't, the concept is they can't use it for other things. It would go back into the fund and actually grow the fund and make us better off, quite frankly. But generically speaking, we want to give the board and the county taxpayers the autonomy to use the dollars that belong to the taxpayers and the family to be able to help when they feel it's appropriate. And I think more often than not, the types of projects we've talked about historically, I would anticipate we'd have their support. So that's one thing. How it's funded, we're working through that as we speak. And how it integrates specifically with the Gulf Enterprise Fund, we're working through as we speak. You may recall that the Gulf Enterprise Fund actually subsidizes the Park Enterprise Fund over $100,000 a year. So as we look at those two funds, there's some relationship between them already. I would say with this scenario, there would continue to be, and that would probably be exacerbated. Because as I mentioned earlier, the endowment wouldn't just be built for dollars to go back to the golf course. It would be for dollars to go back to parks and trails generically, including the golf course. While on the front end, I anticipate both the general fund and the golf course to contribute towards our $1.25 million. I also anticipate those endowment dollars coming back to parks and trails beyond the golf course. They certainly could help the golf course. For example, you'll see next month, and I think you've actually already seen that in the CIP, in the past, we've had the irrigation system replacement. That's a very kind of obvious type of project that dollars like this could go towards. It's tens of thousands of dollars in cost to the golf course. So this might be a nice fit for that. But it could also go towards things like if you decided you wanted to do an expansion of the Eisenbahn Trail, these dollars could go. That was a specific example that we talked about with the families. This is something that could go to that too. So does that answer your questions? Did I miss any?
It did. Thank you. You had mentioned the word consensus, or at least what I thought I heard between the two parties, but I did hear you say that the board would have, I guess, overall approval. So thanks for that clarification between the two trust funds for the overall endowment. And I would think both parties would, want to show what solidarity, if you will, but to your point that there could be a potential disagreement down the line. You made reference of some drastic changes 20 years from now, because perpetuity just means that just because we have a desire or interest and it aligns with all stakeholders 40, 50 years from now, who knows what entertainment is going to look like. Those are only concerns in perpetuity part, because I suspect there's those challenges elsewhere. But forward-thinking bodies such as this, you look at Central Park. Boy, if that wasn't had been done, hundreds of years ago, what would New York City be like? So my point is, yeah, I believe we can support the perpetuity, but the underlying details of how those enterprise funds work within one another, and when committed to the funding, because without those fundings, that 4% interest earning that you spoke to will never be achieved. So the self-sustaining part of it, the sooner we get those fully funded to that $2.5 million is only going to realize those potential investment earnings, that can further fund, projects within the park system or the golf course itself.
Thank you, Supervisor Gallus. And I think County Executive Showman and all of us concur here. We don't know what's going to happen in 20 years from now. You're going to have different generations of those families who are involved with this now, and are also obviously going to have a totally different county board, and we don't know. But at this point in time, at least we're getting the seed planted, and hopefully it'll grow in a positive way. So with that, we'll move on. This committee indeed does throw its endorsement and support behind this activity. The next, we're going to move on to item 6G, a motion to approve the final plat of Lily Acres conditional on Department Administration plat review approval. Is there a motion and a second to move forward with this topic? Supervisor Schulteis, Supervisor Krebs, comments from Mr. Sebo.
Yes, actually, Mr. Chairman and committee, if I could actually, I think you have already met Hannah Kakaisen. She is the planner. She is going to be taking kind of more land division over. So as part of her training, she's going to be kind of finishing up the motion on this project, and we'll be taking land division, like I said, in future projects. So I don't think we have had an official introduction to her for this one, but there is a slight change to the motion on this project, which she'll explain.
Thank you. Hi. So yeah, my name is Hannah Kakaisen. I started at the county about 6 months ago. So I've been training on land division with Paul and Deb, and they've been really helpful. So I would just like to say that the recommendation has changed. The Department of Administration has approved the final plat for Lily Acres. So the recommendation does not need to be conditional on that. Thank you.
Right, good. Very good, Anna. Thank you and welcome. So it's not based on a conditional approval. Mr. Krebs. Oh, I'm sorry. Any other comments or discussion? With that, then I would suggest we vote on this to approve the final plat of Lily Acres. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Very good. Thank you. Move on to item 6H, a motion for no objection to the final plat of Farmstead Creek North Subdivision. We need a motion and a second to move forward with the discussion, please. Supervisor Boltman makes the motion. Is there a second? I'll second. Any discussion on a motion for no objection to the final plat of the Farmstead Creek North Subdivision? Any comments or questions? Mr. Sebo, anything? Oh, nothing. All right. Any other questions or discussion here? If not, we have a motion and a second. I would move that we vote on this. All in favor, say aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Motion passed. Our next meeting will be at 7:30 a.m. on Thursday, July 22nd. We stand adjourned. Thank you.